So, it has been months since we left Mrs. Dean and Cathy when Mrs. Dean burned all those love letters between Cathy and Linton in exchange for not telling Cathy's dad, Edgar. And so naturally, Cathy has been very depressed since then. But she's even more depressed now because her dad, Edgar Linton, has been sick for months and he's been bedridden for months. And in these times when you've been bedridden for months, maybe you're not gonna recover. Anyway, so one day, Mrs. Dean and Cathy were out on a walk, and Mrs. Dean was trying to cheer Cathy up. There was a flower above the wall that borders Thrushcross Grange, and Cathy went up that wall to pluck it to give it to Mrs. Dean. But her hat fell off the other side of the wall, so that means the street. And Cathy went down on the other side to pick it up, but she realized that she couldn't climb the wall back up to get into Thrushcross Grange, which is actually great security. You can't climb over that wall from the street. But suddenly, Mrs. Dean heard hooves coming from the street. She couldn't really see who it was because she was on the other side of the wall, but Cathy started to sound scared. It was Heathcliff. He happened to be riding past Thrushcross Grange, and Cathy just happened to be there. And Cathy didn't want to speak to him. She was like, I don't want to speak to you. Go away. I know about all your history now. My dad told me you're a horrible person. And Heathcliff didn't even care. He was like, yes, whatever. But I just wanted to say, Linton is devastated that you have stopped writing to him all these months. He's gonna die before summer unless you do something about it. Mrs. Dean, on the other hand, she was yelling from the inside. She was like, don't listen to him. He's just trying to control you. But Heathcliff responded over the wall and he said, if all you guys don't believe me, go to Wuthering Heights yourself. You know what? Mrs. Dean, don't even bring Cathy. See for yourself, Mrs. Dean. Anyway, I won't be in Wuthering Heights, so it should be all clear and not awkward for you guys. Just come and see Linton. And that's what Mrs. Dean and Cathy did. The very next day, they both went to Wuthering Heights. Heathcliff, like he said, wasn't there, and the rest of the household seemed to be hiding somewhere in the house. The vibe was they were trying to ignore Linton. When they went in, nobody was around. They couldn't find anybody. Linton was all alone by the fireplace. And also, Linton was whining about the coals not being hot enough. When Linton saw Mrs. Dean, he even tried to order her to do stuff around the house. He even complained to Cathy, not about the writing, but the fact that she used to write to him instead of visiting, because writing tired him out too much. But Cathy wasn't fazed. She was like, but aren't you glad to see me now? I wish you were my brother so we could be together all the time. But this Linton had the audacity to ask, but wouldn't you like it better if I were your husband instead? Ew. And Kathy said, nah, married people fight and hate each other, like your mom and dad. So Linton responded, he was like, how dare you? My mom and dad loved each other. So Kathy said, literally, no, you've literally never seen them in the same room together because your mom left his ass. So Linton said, oh yeah, well, your mom was in love with my dad. Kathy was so angry. She gave Linton's chair a little shove, like a little push. It wasn't even enough for the chair to fall over. In fact, Linton just bumped the arm of his chair. But with that, Linton started violently coughing. It was a suffocating cough that took so long, even Mrs. Dean started to get worried. Like, is this for real now? Kathy, on the other hand, started bawling. She was so sorry, she was panicking. But Linton started moaning and coughing louder. He needed his moans to be louder than Kathy's real crying. Then Linton said, I will never sleep again because of what you did. I'm probably gonna cough to death now. And Mrs. Dean was like, "This is bullshit. Let's bounce, Cathy." Cathy tried one last time. She went up to Linton and said, "Do you really want me to go?" Linton was like, "Just stop talking." So Cathy just sat there quietly. It was very awkward, and finally she started to leave. But as soon as she did that, Linton screamed behind them. And when they looked back, Linton had thrown himself off his chair. Mrs. Dean, of course, wasn't impressed. Mrs. Dean carried Linton and put him on a couch. He was like, "There, he can roll about in there. Let's go." But Linton wasn't happy. He kept moaning about how uncomfortable he was. And Mrs. Dean just told him to get himself a pillow or a cushion or something. But Cathy, poor innocent Cathy, she used her lap and let Linton lay his head on there. And she was like, "How about this?" And Linton was finally satisfied. And Cathy, she was just happy that Linton wanted to do anything with her now. Linton said that Cathy needs to come back tomorrow to help him recover from whatever she just done to him. To which Mrs. Dean was like, "Over our dead body, we're never coming back." But Cathy was like, "Yeah, we are." Mrs. Dean said she was going to change all the locks in Thrushcross Grange so Cathy couldn't come out. But then Mrs. Dean on the very next day caught a cold and she was bedridden for 3 weeks. So she couldn't actually do anything about it. But she wasn't all that worried because Cathy acted like an angel the whole time. She would sit with Mrs. Dean, read her and everything. Mrs. Dean, from her point of view, Cathy was just bouncing back and forth between her dad and Mrs. Dean to help take care of them. So Mrs. Dean was all happy and she recovered within the 3 weeks. But in reality, Cathy would go every day to Wuthering Heights. How we know that is because as soon as Mrs. Dean recovered, she basically caught Cathy riding in and out of Thrushcross Grange using her pony. So Cathy confessed to Mrs. Dean. She said, yes, she has been going to Wuthering Heights every day for 3 weeks. It's been good. Heathcliff has come back, but he would leave Linton and her alone, and Hareton, for the most part, would leave them alone too. Cathy and Linton seemed to have had a good time all those 3 weeks, except for one day. Cathy was on the way to Wuthering Heights that day when Hareton met her outside. Hareton was very excited to see Cathy that day. He told her that he could now read the inscription on top of the doorway to Wuthering Heights. Because remember, Cathy asked him to read it out before, and he admitted that he couldn't read, and Cathy fully bullied him. So now, Hareton said he has learned what the stuff on top of the door says, and it basically said his name, Hareton Earnshaw. And what that means is that poor Hareton didn't even know how to read his own name before. That's how bad Heathcliff did him. So, anyway, Cathy was like, "Great, good job. Now, what does the rest of the inscription say?" There were more words on top of that doorway. And Hareton said he still doesn't know. He hasn't gotten there yet. And so Cathy laughed at Hareton. I don't think she realized how mean she was being, and Mrs. Dean said the same thing when Cathy was recalling those events. She was like, "That's mean. You can't make fun of someone who didn't even have the privilege to learn how to read, and now they're trying." But anyway, Cathy said Hareton that day was so embarrassed, he stormed off, and later, when Cathy and Linton were hanging out, he burst through the door and yelled at them to get out. He said it was his house. He almost threw Linton into the kitchen. He was like, "This is my house, my room. I'm Hareton Earnshaw. My name is on top of that doorway. Get out." And Linton was not okay. He was shrieking. He was in the kitchen now because Hareton like shoved him in there. He was banging on the kitchen door. And Cathy, she also went to the kitchen. Cathy was like, "Just tell your dad." But Linton this time started coughing again, the severe cough from a few days ago, and now he started to cough out blood. So everyone, including Hareton, had to bundle Linton up and take care of him and bring him to his room and everything. It was a whole mess. Afterwards, Hareton even tried to apologize to Cathy. He said he was sorry he lost his temper and if he could do anything to make it right. But Cathy was on her pony at that time. She was riding back to Thrushcross Grange, and she was so scared of Hareton, she just hit him with her whip, and then she rode off back to Thrushcross Grange. At that point, Mrs. Dean heard everything and she decided that enough is enough. She had to tell Edgar Linton everything. She can't handle all of this on her own anymore. It was getting out of hand. And Edgar wasn't angry. He went to speak to Cathy and he spoke more like a sad father having to witness his precious daughter doing something that could seriously hurt her. But at the end of it, he had to lay down the law, which I think he had already laid down before. But the thing is, Cathy cannot go to Wuthering Heights strictly. Linton is allowed to visit Thrushcross Grange any time, though, but Cathy cannot go there anymore. And with that, nothing happened for a few months because Linton was not allowed, or maybe he wasn't even strong enough to physically get to Thrushcross Grange, and Cathy was very obedient. She obeyed her father. She didn't go to Wuthering Heights. Linton did right, though, for the most part, begging Edgar to let Cathy go to Wuthering Heights. But that didn't work. Edgar was like, nope. What worked was asking if they could meet somewhere in the middle then. Edgar finally agreed to that. He was like, okay, fine, fair. Edgar confided in Mrs. Dean even. He was not bedridden anymore, but he was still very weak. He was beginning to worry about dying. He said he used to look forward to that, to be right beside his wife, Catherine. But now he's afraid because he doesn't want to leave Cathy behind. He didn't know what will happen to Cathy. Cathy doesn't inherit Thrushcross Grange, remember? Because she's a girl. The next male heir inherits it, and that's Linton. So Edgar agreed to let Cathy and Linton meet. That was also partially because Edgar was entertaining the fact that Linton and Catherine might marry if Linton and Cathy liked each other so much anyway. The reason for this is that Linton inherits Thrushcross Grange, and that way Cathy can keep living in Thrushcross Grange when Edgar dies. But Edgar was still trying to be practical about it. He asked Mrs. Dean if Linton was worthy of Cathy, because if he wasn't, then Edgar didn't want Cathy to end up with him too, with Thrushcross Grange or without Thrushcross Grange. He just wanted Cathy to be happy and safe. I mean, Cathy is going to have Heathcliff as a father-in-law if all of this happens, so Edgar was trying to be practical about whether Linton would treat Cathy right. The only thing that Edgar didn't know was that Linton was also deteriorating. He didn't know that Linton was also on the brink of death. So, the first meeting of Cathy and Linton was arranged. Edgar said that the condition was to meet right outside of Thrushcross Grange. But when Mrs. Dean and Cathy got there, Linton wasn't there. There was only a messenger who told them that Linton was just a few feet further, just walk a little further. So Mrs. Dean and Cathy went, and before they knew it, they were almost at Wuthering Heights, and Linton is just right there on the grass laying down. He looked so bad. His eyes were sunken. He looked so weak. Cathy tried talking to him and playing with him, but he just looked listless. His eyes wouldn't focus. He was literally fighting for his life. But it didn't register to Cathy how bad Linton was. She even thought that Linton was a lot better because he kept saying that he was a lot better and he just didn't play with her. And Cathy thought that now that he's so much better, he's now uninterested in her. So she got frustrated. She said she was going to leave until he decided that he really wanted to talk to her and engage with her. But as soon as she started to leave, Linton panicked. He kept insisting that he was all better and he kept begging Cathy to tell Edgar that he looks great. He begged Cathy to tell Heathcliff also that he was lively. He was desperate. Mrs. Dean said it looked like he was going to get in a lot of trouble if he acted sick. So Cathy and Mrs. Dean went back, and a week passed, and in that week, Edgar's health has turned for the worse. He was bedridden again, and now it really looked bad. It looked like it wouldn't be long until he succumbed to his sickness. Cathy almost didn't go out for the second meeting with Linton. She wanted to stay with her dad. She wanted to spend every remaining moment with him. But Edgar encouraged her to go. To him, he wanted Cathy to have someone when he died because that was going to be soon. He felt it. He had no idea that Linton was also dying. And the letters from Linton didn't show any sign of weakness either. And Mrs. Dean knew all of this, but she didn't want to tell Edgar that Linton was super weak too, because she didn't want to stress him out even more. She didn't really want to tell him that Cathy didn't have anybody if he died. But the day of the second meeting came, and Cathy and Mrs. Dean set out to go meet Linton. Cathy meant to only go for a little while because she wanted to get back to her dad as soon as possible. When they arrived at the spot, which is the same spot that was so near Wuthering Heights, Linton was there again, and he also looked even more weak. But he also looked more desperate. Heathcliff, this time, was there too. He asked Mrs. Dean and Cathy to help him bring Linton back home. Mrs. Dean said, "No, you guys can carry him yourself." But Cathy was too worried about Linton. She was like, "Let me just bring him to a chair and we'll go." But as soon as they got to Wuthering Heights, Heathcliff locked the doors and told Cathy and Mrs. Dean they couldn't leave. Basically, this is a kidnapping. And the deal was that Cathy had to marry Linton in the morning, or else she could not leave ever. But as soon as she marries Linton, she could leave. She's free to go. Because this was a race on who dies first, right? Heathcliff heard that Edgar was in a bad state, and he wanted to make sure that Cathy marries Linton before Edgar dies. That way, if Linton dies before Edgar does, then Cathy still gets all of the inheritance from Edgar, and Cathy, as Heathcliff's daughter-in-law, is someone who he can control. Cathy said she was going to burn the house down so she could leave. She said if she doesn't go home, her dad would be so worried. Linton was begging Cathy to stay so he wouldn't get punished. This selfish little piece of shit. Cathy begged Heathcliff to just let her and Linton get married right there, right now, so she could go home. But Heathcliff was like, "You know what? It's a bonus delight for me to think about how much your dad will suffer not knowing where you are. So you will definitely stay the night, and we'll do all the wedding stuff tomorrow." So Cathy and Mrs. Dean was locked up in there for the night, and at some point some servants from Thrushcross Grange were even sent out to look for them, and they passed Wuthering Heights. But Mrs. Dean and Cathy missed it. They weren't able to yell from the window. So Cathy cried all night, and Heathcliff was like, "Good. That's gonna be your hobby now, crying." And Heathcliff said good luck to her because she's marrying Linton. Linton is weak, he said, and whiny, but he can also be cruel. Heathcliff said when Linton was well enough before, he would torture cats. So, Cathy and Mrs. Dean that night, they were also separated, if that wasn't even bad enough. Mrs. Dean was kept in Zilla's room, the housekeeper. Zillah was out for the week, so Mrs. Dean was all alone there with enough food to last. But she couldn't see anybody. She was just locked in there, and she didn't know where Cathy was in the house. Guys, Mrs. Dean was locked in there for 5 full days. She did not see or hear anything for 5 days. And finally, Zillah came back. She opened the door and she was like, "Oh my God, you're alive!" News in town was that Mrs. Dean was dead in the moor. She must have fallen into a creek or whatever. Nobody knows that Mrs. Dean was alive in there. But Mrs. Dean didn't care. She just burst through the doors and tried to escape Wuthering Heights. But not before trying to get Cathy too. She found Linton by the fireplace, and Mrs. Dean begged Linton to show her where Cathy was and where the key was. But Linton wouldn't. Linton said that Cathy had not been speaking to him ever since they got married, so it means they did get married, but Heathcliff went back on his word. He didn't release Cathy, he just kept Cathy locked in there. Anyway, they got married, and Cathy has been crying ever since, and Heathcliff had been threatening to strangle her if she didn't stop. She tried to bribe Linton by telling him that she'd give him books, money, her pony, even the most precious thing she had, which was a locket with her parents' pictures in them. She just wanted to go home and see her dad. But Linton said all of those belong to him now because they were married, so why was she even offering those to him? Even Thrushcross Grange belonged to him now, not Cathy. So what Linton did was he took the locket from Cathy because it was his, and now they were just waiting for Edgar to die. Linton said he was just looking forward to it. Linton had zero sympathy towards Cathy. So Mrs. Dean ran home instead. She didn't have Cathy, but she was just gonna send a cavalry over to rescue her. At Thrushcross Grange, she ran up to Edgar. Edgar looked really bad. Dr. Kenneth said he might die the very next day. The best thing that Mrs. Dean thought she could do was not to worry Edgar any further. So instead of telling him that they have been imprisoned the whole week, she told Edgar that Cathy had been in Wuthering Heights this whole time, and she is now married and happily married to Linton. They just couldn't wait, she said. Edgar knew in his dying state, to be fair to him, that Heathcliff probably wanted to arrange that marriage fast because of the inheritance. He guessed that Heathcliff probably heard about him being in a bad state, so he understood, but he was confused about why they had to do it right away, because he had no idea that Linton was a sniveling, weak thing on death's door, too. He did not have context, so he was like, all right, then, they probably truly liked each other, on top of the greedy inheritance thing that Heathcliff wanted. But Edgar had an idea. He was like, okay, before I die, let me get the lawyer to come. I'm going to tell him to set up a trust so that Cathy will still have her own money sent to her every year. I mean, why didn't you do this earlier? But okay. Great. So he sent for the lawyer, but the lawyer was delayed. They waited all night for the lawyer to come. And suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Everyone thought it was the lawyer finally, but it was Cathy. Somehow she was able to scare Linton enough to let her escape. She rushed to her dad, and she and Mrs. Dean agreed to not worry him further on what has happened. I mean, what could Edgar do anyway at this point? So, Edgar was happy until his very last breath. His last words were that he was about to go see the love of his life, Catherine. The lawyer arrived only the next day, and Edgar was gone by then. And the reason was that he was paid off by Heathcliff to not come until Edgar died. So, the only thing that he could do was carry out the will and instructions of the person who owns Thrushcross Grange now, and that was effectively Heathcliff. All servants at Thrushcross Grange were asked to leave, except for Mrs. Dean. She was the only one allowed to stay. Heathcliff even asked Edgar to not be buried beside Catherine, but luckily Edgar had already placed in the will early on that he was to be buried with Catherine, so there was at least nothing they could do about that. And Cathy, the only thing she and Mrs. Dean could hope for was that she would be allowed to stay at Thrushcross Grange. But of course, that didn't happen. Heathcliff came to pick Cathy up. He said he was going to lease out Thrushcross Grange, which is who Mrs. Dean is talking to right now, Mr. Lockwood, so Cathy had to go live at Wuthering Heights. Mrs. Dean begged for her and Zillah to change places. Let Zillah take care of Thrushcross Grange and whoever's gonna rent the place, and let Mrs. Dean stay at Wuthering Heights. So she can still be close to Cathy, you know. But Heathcliff was a smart one. He was like, no. Mrs. Dean said she had not seen Cathy ever since. She tried to visit, but nobody would let her see Cathy. And the only way that Mrs. Dean was able to get news about Cathy was through Zillah. Zillah said that since arriving at Wuthering Heights, Cathy has been locked up in a room with Linton. Linton was super sick, and Heathcliff refused to get a doctor this time. He got what he wanted. He didn't care about what happened to Linton anymore. And nobody in the house was allowed to help. So Cathy was left all alone to take care of a dying boy. Despite everything, she still cared for Linton, even though he was horrible to her. One day, Linton finally passed away. Everybody in the house went up to look, and probably that was the only time they had a look of Cathy too. Cathy looked like life had been sucked out of her as well. Zillah said Hareton looked more disturbed at the sight of Cathy than at Linton's body. She had basically spent so much time caring for someone who was actively dying, who was hopeless because a doctor wasn't even allowed to come. And she didn't have enough tools or help or even kindness, even from the patient probably. Linton was probably a horrible patient too at that point. But nobody knew even today what exactly Cathy went through in that room with Linton dying for weeks. So when Linton died, Heathcliff showed Cathy Linton's will. He had forced Linton to sign all of his possessions, including what would have gone to Cathy, to Heathcliff. So now Cathy, in effect, was destitute. And Heathcliff finally got the revenge he probably wanted. Both sides of the family that bullied him as a kid, even their offsprings, were now suffering under his hands. Cathy stayed locked up in that room after Linton's death. She only finally came downstairs when the weather was too cold. It was winter at that point, probably. It was a Sunday, Zillah said when she first came downstairs to the kitchen, because there was a fire there. That was the only warm spot in the house. But she wouldn't talk to anyone. Hareton tried to be nice. He helped her reach for some books that was in the kitchen. He even tried asking her if she could read to them, but Cathy was not having it. She blew up at everyone. She told them not to bother showing her any kindness now because it was all hypocrisy. Where were they when she needed help before? When she needed a kind word or even to see another face in the house? They weren't there, and now they expect her to play nice? Hareton was taken aback. He was like, why was she blaming him? He offered to help multiple times, but Heathcliff just wouldn't let him. But Cathy wasn't having it. She lashed out at everyone, and in turn, Hareton just avoided her. And Zilla didn't even try to make nice with her either. And that was Cathy that we saw at the very beginning of this story, like 5, 6 episodes ago. She had turned into this venomous, bitter girl in Wuthering Heights. And that was the end of Mrs. Dean's story. Like, yeah, that is all that Mrs. Dean knows at that point in time. But it's not the end of the book yet. So Mrs. Dean has told us and Mr. Lockwood the whole history of Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange. And now we're back to the present, 1801, with Mr. Lockwood, and he has just listened to the entirety of this story. Mr. Lockwood went back as soon as he could to Wuthering Heights, and this time with a letter from Mrs. Dean. Cathy and Hareton were there in the kitchen, and Lockwood tried to secretly drop Mrs. Dean's letter onto Cathy's lap. But as soon as he did, Cathy was like, "What the fuck is this?" And she threw the note onto the floor. That's how damaged Cathy had become. So Mr. Lockwood was like, "That's a letter from Mrs. Dean," but it was too late. Hareton had already picked it up, and he said, by orders of Heathcliff, he says it needs to go through Heathcliff first. And Cathy was full of pride. She didn't want to react. She didn't want to look weak anymore. But she had to turn her head and wipe her eyes as secretly as she could. She just couldn't help it. And Hareton couldn't help it either when he saw Cathy crying. He gave the letter back, but not before flinging it to the ground too, like, "Go pick it up yourself." So Cathy grabbed that note and she read it. And after reading it, she was like, "Does Mrs. Dean like you?" Mr. Lockwood said, "Yeah, very much. We're like gossip buddies." Cathy said, "Okay, can you tell Mrs. Dean I want to write back, but I just can't because I don't have anything to write with? I don't have a pen or paper, not even books that I can tear pages out of to write on." Cathy said she used to have books, but Heathcliff burned them, and she couldn't find any other book in the house. She knows that Hareton has a secret stash in his room, and he's just butchering them with his pronunciation because he can't even read. Hareton was right there. He was so embarrassed. He went up to his room, grabbed the stash of books, and threw them into Cathy's lap. He was like, "There, have the books. I don't want to read or think of them again." But Cathy said she didn't want them because if she reads them, she'll remember how Hareton read them, and then she proceeded to read them as if someone who was still trying to learn to read. She was making like dumb, stupid noises that, to exaggerate Hareton as he was trying to practice reading in his room. And so Hareton was even more mortified. He grabbed the books and then threw them into the fire. Finally, at that point, Heathcliff arrived at Wuthering Heights, and Mr. Lockwood told him that he was just gonna go. He was not going to renew his lease at Thrushcross Grange. He still had the rest of 12 months all paid up, but he was just gonna leave for London, and he didn't know if he'll ever have a chance to be back. So, goodbye to all of you. And as Mr. Lockwood was leaving, he thought about how it was such a waste because he had almost fallen in love with Cathy when Mrs. Dean was telling him the whole story. I mean, he even asked Mrs. Dean to go and hang Cathy's portrait in the house so he could look at it. And Mrs. Dean said she would have loved for him to end up with Cathy so he can save her from Wuthering Heights. But it was all a mess, and Mr. Lockwood left for London. But this is not the end of the story. So, almost a year has passed when Mr. Lockwood had business in a nearby town. He realized that he was actually kind of near Thrushcross Grange and his lease is still in effect. So he just decided to go and spend the night there instead of paying extra for an inn. He looked for Mrs. Dean there at Thrushcross Grange, but the new housekeeper there said Mrs. Dean was now at Wuthering Heights. So Mr. Lockwood was like, okay, I'm gonna take a walk and look for my bestie. Mr. Lockwood went to Wuthering Heights, and as he approached it, he noticed that all of the windows were open, and out of the windows were voices. Two voices, Hareton's and Cathy's. Hareton was trying to read a book, and Cathy was teasing him gently for reading it wrong. But this time, Mr. Lockwood noticed that Cathy was holding Hareton's hand while he was reading, and Hareton seemed almost distracted by the fact that she was holding his hand. And also, Hareton just asked Cathy to kiss him if he read it right, and he did. And Cathy did kiss him? Mr. Lockwood looked with envy because Cathy looked radiant and beautiful now, just like in the portrait. And Mr. Lockwood realized that he had missed his chance with her. Mr. Lockwood went to the kitchen and found Mrs. Dean. Mrs. Dean was ecstatic to see him, but they went right back to gossiping. So, what happened was, soon after Mr. Lockwood left for London, Zillah quit. So Heathcliff asked Mrs. Dean to come to Wuthering Heights. Anyway, there wasn't anybody in Thrushcross Grange. And that seemed to be the thing that turned the tide on Wuthering Heights. With Mrs. Dean there, Cathy was more herself, and she finally had an ally. Mrs. Dean brought her books, and that kept Cathy satisfied at first, but Cathy became bored quick. And that was when she turned her attention on Hareton. Cathy would read out loud in the kitchen as if she was reading to Mrs. Dean, but it would be mostly to Hareton. But Hareton at that point wouldn't budge. He would not acknowledge her, he would not react to anything he did. Cathy would try to talk to him, but he wouldn't budge. And then Cathy found out that Hareton actually defended her so many times against Heathcliff before, and Heathcliff even lost his temper at Hareton a few times. Cathy just didn't know it, or she knew it, but she was just too broken to care at that point. So, what Cathy did next was give Hareton a little peck in the cheek. And Hareton was too embarrassed. He couldn't look at anyone. Cathy then brought Hareton a book with a lot of pictures in it, and offered to teach him how to read it. And Hareton accepted, and that was the beginning of everything. At first, Heathcliff still terrorized everyone, especially Cathy. But Cathy had become less afraid of Heathcliff now that she had two allies in the house, Mrs. Dean and Hareton, and she knew Hareton can kick Heathcliff's ass. Hareton did not exactly want to go in between Heathcliff and Cathy. To Hareton, Heathcliff was almost like a father figure to him. He was a bad father, for sure, but to Hareton, Heathcliff housed and fed him when he had nothing and when he had Hindley as a dad. Which is not right, I know, but that's Hareton's experience. One day, Heathcliff came home to find Cathy and Hareton sitting together, enjoying a book. The whole house had this warm, cheery air, and as soon as Heathcliff came in, everyone was on edge. But instead of screaming and assaulting everyone, like the usual, Heathcliff just asked everyone to go away and not to bother him. Heathcliff then told Mrs. Dean that he felt a change inside him. He still hated Cathy so much. You'd think he'd had some sympathy or care towards Cathy, being that she is Catherine's baby, but He hated that girl. His soft spot, despite all the terrible things he's done, was actually on Hareton, because Hareton had Catherine's eyes. And that was actually part of the reason why he kept Hareton, he said. Partly because he wanted to make sure that this boy was degraded, but also because I think he saw a little bit of Catherine in Hareton. Heathcliff said he no longer felt like he wanted any more revenge on the two families. Even though the original people were dead, their offsprings were here and ready for him to torment further. He somehow lost that appetite. He's just done. Just ask them to not bother him anymore from this point onwards. And then over the next 4 days, Heathcliff did not eat or drink anything. He was suddenly smiling, and that in itself was creepy to everyone. Everyone was freaked out. He was still not nice to anyone, but he started just smiling to himself. He started taking long walks out, muttering to himself, and Mrs. Dean heard Catherine's name a bunch of times. And after 4 days of not eating or drinking anything and taking long walks outside in the rain, Mrs. Dean finally found Heathcliff dead in his bedroom. It was the scariest shit for Mrs. Dean. He had his eyes open and he was smiling when he died. Heathcliff was buried right next to Catherine. Apparently, he paid people to make sure he was buried in between Edgar and Catherine. And not just that, he paid people to remove one wall of his own coffin and one wall of Catherine's coffin so that in death they would be laying side by side, skin to skin, I guess. Much to the scandal of the town, all of this, like the whole thing. And also, it's not fair. Heathcliff, in the end, did go out smiling. He did go out after he had his fill of revenge. And he also got to be buried next to Catherine. People in town say that on some nights, they would find a man and a woman walking around together on the moors, and they would eerily look like Heathcliff and Catherine. Anyway, now that Heathcliff was dead, Cathy then gets the inheritance. Cathy and Hareton plan to get married in a few months, and they plan to move to Thrushcross Grange. Mrs. Dean told Mr. Lockwood that she was now glad that Mr. Lockwood didn't try to go after Cathy, because this turned out to be the best thing that could have happened. The two kids that Mrs. Dean nursed from when they were born are now together, and she is the happiest woman in the world for it. Kind of like their mom. And that is finally the end of Wuthering Heights. If you made it all the way to this point, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed all of that, and I hope you appreciate the entirety, the drama of Wuthering Heights as much as I did. See you guys in the next one.